the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined once again by friend of the show, Sylvia Barbara Soberton. Sylvia, welcome back.
Welcome. Hello, and thank you so much for having me. It's always such a great pleasure and so much fun.
It's been a little while since I've had you on the show, so I'm very excited to have you on today to talk about the topic of your new book. And your book is titled, I always got to look at it to make sure I don't say it wrong, Marriage, Tudor Style, Love, Hate, and Scandal. I love this topic because who is better at scandalous marriages than the Tudors, right?
They are the best.
and they're led off by Henry VIII, who had the most scandalous history of all marriages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what, I mean, other than that, what made you decide to do this topic this time? Was there something that inspired you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm always interested in bringing up the stories of lesser known Tudor people. And, you know, as you said, Henry VIII was a married monarch. He married 6 times, and all of his marriages, except perhaps the first one, created scandals when they were contracted. And I thought to myself, well, Henry VIII wasn't the only person in Tudor England who married scandalously. So I wanted just to delve into those lesser known stories and highlight them, because I think they are really good stories and deserve to be told.
There are so many scandalous marriages at Tudor court. I think I need to start off with, which one is your favorite?
My favorite is the first one that I mentioned in the book, which is Anne Stafford and George Hastings. That's my ultimate favorite because it's from early in Henry VIII's reign. It's from 1510. And this story, I feel, is not covered in entirety when it comes to like history books, because it's usually just skimmed over and, oh, just Henry VIII had this affair with a married woman. But what the real story here is, I think, is that Anne Stafford wasn't Henry VIII's mistress. She was William Compton's mistress. And it was such a huge scandal because everybody thought like, oh, she's having an affair with the king. And then we have the evidence from other various sources saying, well, she's probably having an affair with Compton, and Compton later in his life makes certain mentions of Anne, for example, in his last will, leaving her interest in a piece of his land, highly unusual because she wasn't related to him. And also Compton was cited for adultery at some point by the Cardinal Wolsey. So that's very interesting. And I think there's enough evidence to show that Compton and Anne Stafford had an affair. And it's interesting because that's early in Henry VIII's reign. She's sent to a nunnery, but she comes back. And her husband takes her back. Then later she gives birth to so many children, and her husband doesn't really have any doubts that the children are his. So they were probably able to reconcile, and I don't know, he probably forgave her considering the evidence that we have.
Yeah.
So that's my favorite.
One of the things that you mentioned in this book about that relationship was that at this point in Henry VIII's reign, he wasn't known to have affairs with married women.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I found that interesting.
Yeah, that's something a theory that I'm developing for my next book, or the book that I'm working on right now. It's often assumed that Henry VIII was sleeping with married women, but the only married woman with whom his name was ever linked is Anne Stafford. And we don't even know, we can't be sure 100% that she was his mistress because her name was linked to Compton. And it's interesting that all of Henry VIII's other mistresses that we know that he slept with for sure were young and unmarried. Mm. And I think it's because Henry knew that if his name would be linked to a married woman, that would create a huge scandal because that creates tensions among his courtiers, and his courtiers would probably hate him for that. So I think he avoided deliberately sleeping with married women just not to create tensions among the people with whom he was in close contact every day, his servants, basically. So that's one of the reasons why I don't believe why one of the women that I describe in the book as well, Mary Boleyn, had an affair with the king when she was a married woman. I don't think so. I think that the affair was conducted before she married, and maybe she was married off to end that affair. That's why I think also the children that were born to Mary, some historians say, oh, they were Henry VIII's children. Why didn't he recognize them as his? Well, the answer to that is very, very easy, because the children were born when Mary was married to William Carey. And the legal assumption then, as now, was that the children were her husband's. So if she would have been unmarried, like Bessie Blount, and became pregnant with the king's child, then there would be no doubts whatsoever about the child's paternity. And that's why Henry recognized Bessie's child, but didn't recognize any children by Mary Boleyn if he had them with her. So yeah, that's also very interesting angle, I think, to look at Henry VIII, that he was deliberately choosing women who were unmarried, young, and also he preferred them as virgins so that he would be their first man. When you look at all of his mistresses, and we don't even have that many, they were all young, unmarried. And he later in his life, he took interest in arranging marriages for them too. So.
Yeah. The interesting thing to me about Anne Stafford is her family background, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. She was the sister of the Duke of Buckingham. He was the greatest magnate at Henry VIII's court. He was related to the king because he was the son of Catherine Woodville, who was one of the numerous sisters to Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of England. She was married to Edward IV. And Buckingham's father was the Duke Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who was executed during the reign of King Richard III for his rebellion. So that's an interesting background right there. And of course, Buckingham himself was executed in 1521. Well, let me just tell you, there was no love lost between Buckingham and the king. They were kind of, there was a rivalry there between them. And there is this story that derives from a secondary source, but nevertheless, it's interesting, and it shows Buckingham's pride in his heritage, because he said when he saw, allegedly, when he saw his sister with the king, he said, well, she's not, or with Compton, he said, she's not a game for Comptons or for the Tudors either. So that really kind of shows you how proud he was. But I wasn't able to trace this in the primary source material, though. So I think it derives from a secondary source, from the book from the 1970s. But I like this quote I quite like it, because it shows you how proud Buckingham really was. And even if it's not true, it still somewhat captures the essence of his character.
Yeah, there were definitely, when you said there was no love lost between the two, that is definitely the best way to say it when it comes to the relationship between
Put it mildly.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I found really interesting, I'm going to kind of jump all over because I'm looking at your table of contents here, so I'm not really going to go in any like chronological order at all. But I found very interesting the chapter that you wrote about Henry Percy and Mary Talbot. And now, why don't you give everybody a little bit of background on why this marriage is significant to the Tudor history as a whole?
Because Henry Percy is known as Anne Boleyn's boyfriend before she caught the king's eye. And there was a pre-contract between them. George Cavendish, Cardinal Wolsey's servant, has a whole story covered in his book, in his contemporary account. And he says that they were in love, and that there grew such a secret love between them when Percy was visiting the court with Wolsey in his entourage. And he fell in love with Anne, and she fell in love with him, and they basically made a pre-contract, which means that they promised each other to marry, possibly sealed it with a consummation, And that was enough back then. If you had witnesses to this pre-contract and if you had consummation afterwards, it was almost indissoluble. But we have evidence from Cavendish, who says, well, the king was already in love with Anne and he wanted her for himself, and he ordered Cardinal Wolsey to break up the match. And Anne didn't know it at the time. She thought that perhaps this was because Wolsey thought she was no good for Percy. And that's true, because Wolsey called Anne a foolish girl yonder in the court, which is interesting. And he considered her not good enough for Percy, because Percy was the son and heir of the 5th Earl of Northumberland. So he would have, he had the prospect of becoming an earl in the future. So Anne would become a countess. And Anne's father at the time was only a knight. And Percy was promised to the Earl of Shrewsbury's daughter, Mary Talbot. And they had the conversation about this match for quite a while, for several years. And the match came about in about 1526, by March of 1526. But the pre-contract was kind of haunting Percy and Mary until Percy's death. Because in 1532, there was this, I would say it was a conspiracy to oust Anne Boleyn from the position of power, to just remove her altogether, because she had many enemies by that time. And at some point, the story goes like this, that at some point, Mary Talbot was told by Henry Percy that they were not really married, that he was pre-contracted to Anne Boleyn, and that their marriage was invalid. And I think there might have been something like that between them, because they were unhappy together. And perhaps there was a quarrel during which Percy told his wife, you know, you're not really my wife, because I was pre-contracted to Anne Boleyn. But then Anne Boleyn takes this story to Henry VIII, and she basically says, I'm not pre-contracted. You can check that. Talk with Percy. And Percy promises on oath, on the Holy Sacrament, that he was never pre-contracted to Anne Boleyn. That's the second time that he does this, because he had to promise that there was no pre-contract when Wolsey was breaking up their match. And now in 1532, he does the same. He promises on the Holy Sacrament, which is interesting. And then in 1536, leading up to Anne's execution, this story of the pre-contract is heated up again, because Thomas Cromwell is looking for a way to annul Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. And the first and the most efficient route would be to, you know, uncover that pre-contract story, heat it up, the old controversy, and just go with it. But Percy, again, he says, well, I swore on the damnation of my soul in 1532 that I was not pre-contracted to Anne Boleyn. And I'm doing this the same thing now. I wasn't pre-contracted to her. And it's interesting that many historians still say that, well, Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII was annulled based on that pre-contract. But it wasn't. Because when Percy died, his widow, Mary Talbot, she petitioned the king to have some money from Percy's lands. And she says, well, she basically introduces herself as Percy's widow, the Countess of Northumberland. And I think that if Henry VIII used the pre-contract story to annul his own marriage to Anne Boleyn, then it would have worked both ways. Then Mary Talbot's marriage to Henry Percy would have been annulled as well, but it wasn't. So I do believe, like I would repeat after the late historian Eric Ives, that the reason why Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn was annulled was because Henry VIII used the fact that he knew carnally Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. And that's really well explained in Ives's book, and I repeated that in my book in the chapter where I describe, when I discuss the marriage between Mary Talbot and Henry Percy. And what I also personally find very interesting about the Talbot-Percy marriage is that they were so unhappy together, but they at some point they had a child together, and this baby was unfortunately a stillbirth. And after that, it was in 1529, they parted ways. And Mary was depressed for a while, And she also suffered from a falling sickness, which was a term for epilepsy, which is also not often mentioned in the accounts of Percy's life or Mary Talbot at all. Is a footnote in history, which is interesting because she lived quite long. She outlived her husband. She outlived Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and all of those people who were involved in the scandal of her, that her marriage was. But yeah, she outlived them all, and she died as an old lady, basically. She was a Catholic. She led a very interesting life, although maybe not as a typical Tudor woman, because her husband, before he died, he made Henry VIII his heir, so that meant that he deprived Mary of the lands that she would have had as a widow, which was kind of cruel on his part. Really shows you the way what he really thought about her. And it's the reality of many people back in the 16th century who were kind of forced to be married, and it didn't really work out for them. Some people made their marriages work even though they were not love matches. They later settled into comfortable companionships, friendships. Some marriages turned into love, but not in this case, unfortunately.
It really does make you wonder, like, what was it that they didn't like each other so much? Was it their personalities, or was it just how their relationship started? Like, we just probably will never know. But I do love that you brought up the epilepsy thing, because when I was reading that chapter, because that chapter caught my eye and I thought, I have to check this out. I was very intrigued by that, because you're right. It's not something that's talked about very often. And one of the other things that you touched base on was how sometimes epilepsy was seen as a demonic possession.
Yes.
And I thought that was interesting too, because for somebody who doesn't understand what it was, I could see how they would think that that could be what was causing it.
At some point, even Percy isolated his wife. He put her, I think, in one of his castles, and he closed her there. And the Duke of Norfolk was like, "What are you doing?" And I think it was connected to her illness. That maybe Percy didn't want anyone to know that Mary was suffering from this disease. And Norfolk was like, "Well, if she is really sick, as people whisper, then you should release her." So at least he, wanted to help her out in this situation. But it's interesting that she lived into the 1570s, I think. So she lived quite a long life, even though she was ill. But she never remarried, and she never had any more children. So that's also very telling. Yeah.
Yeah, the poor thing. Well, when we look at scandalous marriages, my favorite family always comes into play the Seymours. And
right. I know that. I
want to say the most scandalous story from the Seymours is definitely Edward Seymour's first marriage to Catherine Falal. And I'm sure most people listening are familiar with the scandal that's associated with it. I'm very interested in your take on what happened in this marriage and what caused it to fall apart.
Well, we know that Edward Seymour was married twice. His first wife, Catherine, then Anne Stanhope. Anne Stanhope is more famous because they had such a great relationship. They had like a bunch of children together, a very harmonious relationship. But his first marriage, a scandal. But most secondary sources will tell you that Catherine Falal was having an affair with her father-in-law, so with Sir John Seymour of Wolfhall. And I can't tell you why this is. This is because in the 17th century, one historian says, well, she was repudiated because she was known carnally by her father. And in this case, her father would meant her father-in-law, obviously not her father. And there is not one single contemporary source that says this, that she had slept with her father-in-law. But her own father says that, well, in his last will, he says she is in a nunnery, and she has no right to inherit some of my lands and my possessions. So he basically disinherited her, and that's because if she's in a nunnery while married, that means that she committed something, that she made something that put her there. So I think she had an affair when she was married with somebody whose name we don't know. And I think the confusion possibly also stems from the fact that her son, John, was named John, and Sir John Seymours, of Wolf Hall is John. And Sir John of Wolf Hall also had an illegitimate son called very confusingly John. So there are three Johns in this story.
Mm-hmm.
But we know also that Catherine, that she died before March of 1535 because Edward Seymour married Anne Stanhope, and he wouldn't have been able to remarry if his wife was still alive, because even if a spouse committed adultery, it would not have been possible for the other spouse to remarry. The marriage could have been, they could have been simply separated, but they had to wait until the spouse dies so that they can remarry.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the fact that Sir John Seymour had an illegitimate son also named John, because I feel like that likely is where the confusion comes, since there isn't any really contemporary discussion of him having an affair with his daughter-in-law, that at some point in history, right, somebody was like, well, he did have an illegitimate son named John. It must be the same John, right?
I think so. I think the confusion stems from this. And also it's interesting that when Henry VIII was courting Jane Seymour, so John Seymour's daughter, she says, well, when she refused to become the royal mistress, she says, well, I was born of honorable parents. And I think that would have been ridiculous if people knew widely that her father was having an affair with, her sister-in-law. That would have been utter, dumb thing to say in front of the king. But I think, she felt comfortable saying that because there was no blood, there was no scandal attached to her name or to her parents and her sister-in-law. It's those were her actions, and the fact that we don't know that much about it is also interesting. It indicates that the story was quickly suppressed, and Catherine she died by March of 1535. She died. So and also I find it very interesting that Edward Seymour's son and heir, another Edward Seymour, can you believe it? He ordered a pedigree, and in this pedigree, he mentioned that his father was married before he married Anne Stanhope, so Edward Seymour's mother, and her name is not even given there. She's just daughter of William Philol, which is interesting that that even her name was almost written out of history. That's interesting.
Yeah, it really does make you wonder what she did and who she did it with. And I always go back to, and I just talked to Dr. Elizabeth Norton about this, and you and I are on the same page as this. Elizabeth and I are definitely not, but I just have a hard time believing that Henry VIII would attach himself to a family that had such scandal attached to their name. Why would he do that after what just happened with Anne Boleyn? Why would he again attach his name?
Well, exactly. I don't think that because we have to understand it as from the 16th century point of view. So if you had sex with your daughter-in-law, that would have been an incest. So a huge, not only scandal, but a sin in the eyes of the church. So I don't think that Henry VIII would have attached himself to a family that would have been so scandalous. But at the same time, we do know that Catherine committed some sort of a sin, and I think it was adultery, because Edward Seymour also sought to disinherit his children by her, and the children who inherited his lands, titles, and so on were the children from his second marriage, so that he felt absolutely sure that his second wife was faithful to him, that there was no question about the children being his, which is also interesting because in the television series The Tudors, Anne Stanhope is depicted as this unfaithful wife, which is an utter nonsense. But she's, again, in that series, she's an amalgamation of the real Anne Stanhope and Catherine Tyrrell. So there you have it. But the real Anne Stanhope, she wasn't unfaithful to her husband. They had a great relationship, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Tudors on Showtime really had a bad habit of making amalgamations of characters.
Oh, yes. That was the one that really made me very angry about Anne Stanhope, because I think she didn't deserve it. She was a good wife. She loved her husband. She had like a bunch of children, I think 10 children. Can you imagine having 10 children? Oh my goodness.
No, I definitely can't. It was her story and the Mary/Margaret Tudors story
that's
too.
the one also, yeah.
And I get so mad when I hear that the reason that they did that was to not confuse the American viewers. And I thought, we're not that dumb.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Just
No.
because there's so many Marys and Margarets, I'm pretty sure we can keep them separate in our minds.
Well, they basically cut out the whole Jane Grey storyline with this. So even if they wanted to make more seasons, they wouldn't be able to, because Jane Grey, didn't exist in that universe. So
that I never even thought about that. Thank you
I
for
thought that
bringing
was so stupid.
Yeah, Jane never existed in this universe.
Yes.
That's crazy. Wow.
Wow.
You just blew my mind a little bit with that.
Okay. Well, I'm glad, I guess.
Okay. All right. So we talked about that scandalous Tudor marriage. Now, of course, we have to talk about my favorite one, which most people never agree with me on this one anyway, but the marriage of Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr, which, of course, I think everybody knows that they looked to possibly marry before Henry VIII laid his eyes on Catherine Parr. And then she married Henry VIII because she thought that that's what God wanted her to do. Exactly, yes. And of course, it was probably the right choice for her in the end. It definitely brought her all the power that she needed to make changes that she wanted. It allowed her to become the writer that she likely wanted to be as well. The thing that we always look at is what happened after Henry VIII died and how quickly they married. Now, I know there's some dispute, some discussion about how quick it was. I think it was much quicker than anybody knows. And I think that had a lot to do with Catherine just wanting to get what she wanted this time around. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I think so, because Henry VIII died in January. He was buried in February, and by May, Catherine and Thomas, they exchange love letters, and he already describes her as his wife, and she describes herself as his wife as well. So I think they married in May, but possibly also earlier, because Catherine, I think her main goal in marrying so quickly was that she really wanted to have a child. And she was about 35, so she was in her mid 30s, not so young considering the 16th century Moors and stuff like that. So she really wanted to have a child. He was her fourth husband, and we don't know, maybe she was pregnant before, but those pregnancies were not recorded. And if she had any miscarriages, we wouldn't know about it either. So yeah, it was a highly scandalous marriage because of the speed, because people assumed that she would be grieving after the great old Henry VIII. And she was like, no.
She was like, nope, I'm
getting what I want now.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a thing to admire, because she didn't really think about other people or what other people would think about her. She was thinking purely about herself this time.
Yeah.
I applaud.
Yeah, I love that for her too. One of the things you mentioned early on in this chapter was new to me. And we're going to talk about the Duchess of Suffolk, because I knew that she had named her dog. What was it? Wolsey?
Gardiner, I think. Gardiner after
yes, that's who it was.
After the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner.
Now, you made a mention about her naming, I think it was other animals.
Yeah, her horse.
Okay, let's talk about this.
Her horse, Seymour, and the mare, the bay mare, Parr, which is which is interesting. Catherine, the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, she was a lady with a sense of humor. She was really I feel like she was this great person to be around, and she was really sarcastic, snarky when she wanted to be. And I think this is a reflection of her naming her animals after people, various scandals like that. I think this is a reflection of her great sense of humor. Not necessarily that she was trying to be snarky or anything, just that she had a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
Although I don't know Catherine Parr's reaction to this, I can imagine she wouldn't have been very happy.
Do you remember where you found that information?
No.
I was taken aback when I read that. I went, I have never heard this before, but I love it because it goes along with the gardener, the dog story.
It does, yeah.
I love that. Okay, so we had Edward Seymour, Catherine Falal, Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr. I don't even want to talk anymore about that marriage because it's just too scandalous to even talk about.
It is very scandalous, yeah.
There's just so much in that story to me that I feel like
I know you're personally attached to this story, so
I am, and I get really, really upset sometimes when we talk about this story because I feel like there are parts of it that people are unwilling to look at and see from a different perspective. So do you mind if we just move on to another Seymour?
Yeah, I just want to tell one thing about this marriage, that the love letters that they exchanged were really like love letters, what you would expect of a love letter. And Henry VIII's love letters to Anne Boleyn pale in comparison to Catherine Parr's and Thomas Seymour. So I encourage people to just go and read those letters because they are really good.
They are
really beautiful love letters. Like you would say that there was love between them, and it really shows in those letters.
Yeah, that is our documentary evidence that they loved each other. Ignore all of the other stuff that we hear after all of that and just look at the evidence of the love that these two actually had for one another.
Exactly, yeah. I don't think that Catherine would have been that quick to sacrifice her reputation to marry someone she didn't even remotely like. I think she was very much in love with him.
Yeah, and the fact that in 1543, she wanted to marry him.
Yes.
And as soon as Henry VIII died in January of 1547, she's like, I've been pining over this guy since I married Henry VIII, and here's my opportunity. Yeah. He's not married.
And that he remained single. That's also interesting, that for all the years that Catherine was married to Henry VIII, I think he was waiting for her.
I would like to think that too. That's always
the biggest question.
When you think about it,
like it is quite a romantic story. It is. It's probably one of the most romantic stories in the book, because you can really feel and see that there was love between those two people.
I just, I love those two. I think their story just needs to be talked about more in a less scandalous way. Let's detach Elizabeth from that story altogether and just focus on those two and just ignore the scandal that comes with. Anyway, I'm not going to go down a path that I don't want to go down right now. Okay. All right. Let's transition to Edward Seymour and Catherine Grey, because here's another one, right? Married in secret, going against the Queen's wishes. Holy cow! That's all I can say. These guys, this is another love story, right?
Yes, it is. It was a love story. It was a love story, and well, Catherine Grey, she was one of the sisters of Jane Grey. And she was, according to the Henry VIII's last will, she was next heiress to the throne after Queen Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth I didn't really like it because she was, I don't want to say jealous, but she was jealous of Catherine. And she really didn't want to name a successor, as we know, because she was afraid that anyone whom she might name would conspire against her, and people would gather around that person, like people gathered around Elizabeth when Queen Mary I was on the throne. There were a lot of conspiracies, and Elizabeth later said that her life was in danger during Mary's reign, so she would never make that mistake of naming an heir. And there was a lot of confusion during early reign of Elizabeth because she was still young, and people, her counselors were like, you have to marry, produce children. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so people were speculating about her next heir, of course. And Catherine Grey was among a group of people named as possible successors to the Queen if something happened to Elizabeth. And so in 1536, Henry VIII made it an offense if someone deflowered or married an heiress to the crown. That was illegal. That was an offense punishable. And, well, I think that neither Catherine Grey nor Edward Seymour really thought about the deeper meaning of their marriage. They were just two people in love who wanted to be married, who wanted to be together, and they didn't really think that their marriage would be so scandalous and disliked by the Queen, because they thought, well, you know what, at the end of the day, Catherine is the Queen's cousin, and she would be forgiven, and all of this would be forgotten, and they would live happily ever after. But unfortunately for them, Elizabeth just didn't want to forgive them for this offense. Mm-hmm. And the worst thing about it, I think, for Elizabeth, from Elizabeth's standpoint, was that Catherine became pregnant almost immediately. It's a scandalous tidbit, I think, from this is that Catherine and Edward had sex in the maiden's chamber. So they were really into each other, and she became pregnant almost immediately. And Edward was abroad at this time, and Catherine was like, you know what, my belly is growing and I can't hide it anymore. And she was like looking for help around the people who were close to Elizabeth, because a sad thing about Catherine is that she lost her parents. Her father was executed in 1554. Her mother died also, so she was basically without a good counsel. Nobody was able to give her good advice. So yeah, and when Elizabeth learned about the secret marriage, the pregnancy, she was furious, and she sent them first, to house arrest, to the Tower of London. They had sex in the Tower of London on several occasions. She becomes pregnant again. I mean, you can't make this up. And again, Elizabeth is furious, and the sons named Edward and Thomas. So again, there's second generation of the Seymour brothers, who are Edward and Thomas. And they are considered not so briefly, for many years, actually, until their deaths and until Elizabeth's death, they are considered her possible heirs to the throne because they are boys. But Elizabeth ruled that the marriage between Catherine and Edward was invalid, and the children illegitimate. Because it's interesting that the priest that married Catherine and Edward couldn't be found. He just disappeared. And the only witness to the marriage, Jane Seymour, Edward Seymour's sister, died, sadly, of tuberculosis. And so there was really no witness, nobody who could confirm their version of the story. And so Elizabeth saw her chance in invalidating that match. And Catherine Grey never really returned to favor or to court. She was under house arrest in several manor houses. She was becoming depressed. She stopped eating, and she eventually died, I think in 1567. She was still in her late 20s, very young, mother of two. But she never returned to Elizabeth's favor, and that's the saddest part, that this story is so tragic. And I think even people who supported Elizabeth's decisions were like, this is too much. You should allow them to live together as a family. And she did not, which, it kind of shows you the cruel side of Elizabeth's character, that she was maybe just like her father in some respects. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it added some insult to injury that they had sons too. She's like, here you go, you marry in secret, and then you have sons on top of it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think when you look at Elizabeth, she was very jealous of her courtiers having, marrying, having children. And she, as queen, she was expected to do the same, but she didn't. And from some, I do respect her for that, although I may not like her as a, historical character. I don't like Elizabeth I. That's one of my unpopular historical opinions, I guess. I don't like her, but I do respect her decision for not marrying, because, marriage and children, they defined a woman's status back then. But, she didn't do it, so respect to Elizabeth. But she was bitter about other people doing it. So again, that's why I don't like her.
I know. I feel I'm always torn when it comes to Elizabeth as well.
Yeah.
It's like, well, she reigned a long time. She had a
And she's
great,
fascinating. I mean, she is, but
part of you has to feel sorry for her too, that she wasn't able to have maybe what she wanted in the end as well. And these poor Seymours.
Yeah, I mean, the scandalous marriages just seem to run in the family. It's
they
like
really do.
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we look at Edward Seymour and Anne Stanhope, which seemed to be a very successful marriage, but it ended with him losing his head. So there's a sad ending. We moved to Thomas and Catherine Parr, which ended with both of them dead, and their infant or toddler daughter disappearing from records.
That's
and
very
then
sad.
Right. And then we have Edward Seymour and Catherine Grey, who seems to be another love match, who are torn apart. And
yes. And even their son married in secret. So another Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, he marries Honora Rogers, a woman named Honora Rogers, and they are in love. They're madly in love. And Anne Seymour is like, no, you're not. But eventually she forgave them, and they were a happy ending of this story. And there's also William Seymour, grandson, who married Arabella Stewart.
yes.
So that's another tragic story. So yeah, those Seymours, right?
Well, they definitely had eyes on power. They were very ambitious. And that goes back a long ways with the family. And I think I'm currently writing, you and I have been talking about the Seymours a lot lately, and I'm currently writing an article for my website about how they are so overlooked and how really their ambitions go back centuries, and people just don't realize it. They think that the Seymours just came to the forefront of history during the reign of the Tudors, and that is so not true. It was before then, and I hope we can shed more of a light on this family, because they have some wonderful stories to share, don't you think?
Absolutely, I agree with that, yes.
And one day I'll publish my book.
I hope so. I'm desperate to read it.
Yes, I feel like I have so much research into this and so much time into it that now I feel the pressure of just wanting to make sure that I do it right and I get it out there the right way.
Yeah, I know you will.
I appreciate you've always been so supportive of this. Sylvia,
I also love the Seymours, Jane Seymour has been one of my favorite wives of Henry VIII for a long time, but I feel like she's unfairly treated by historians, because we still tend to look at her through this Victorian lens, where she's described as either a doormat or someone who wasn't very ambitious, or but I think there's so much more to Jane than we think.
There is so much more, and I just put out an episode.
I haven't heard it yet. Haven't listened to it yet, because it was like 1 hour ago. But
it was an eye opener, because the new research that Elizabeth Norton is doing on Jane Seymour is digging into some of the sources that even I didn't know about, and I'm so excited, because this is an academic book that she is writing. And it really is the untold stories of Jane. It is a side of Jane Seymour that nobody knows. And I'm so excited for this to get out there.
Too.
I can't. The episode was fun, but even the episode, I feel like it's only scratching the surface on what Elizabeth is going to.
Probably more in that book. So we should get it when it's out.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait. But speaking of books, we need to get yours into the hands of people. Yeah. So, guys, I got to look down again and make sure I get the name right.
It's a long title.
Marriage Tudor Style, Love, Hate, and Scandal is exactly. Sylvia's new book that was just released. Sylvia, if people want to get their hands on this book, where can they find it?
You can get it from Amazon or from bookshops, wherever you get your books from. It's available as hardback, as paperback, and as ebook. So however you like your books, you just get it, grab it while you can.
It is there. And what a great topic. We've only scratched the surface today on the subject matter. There's so much more we could have talked about, but I want to leave that to the readers. Sylvia, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. It was a great pleasure.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.